Before the pyramids pierced the skies of Giza, before golden pharaohs ruled from grand palaces, there was a time when Egypt was not yet one. Two lands existed, two peoples, two crowns, two destinies. In the fertile marshes of the north, life flowed with the delta's tangled rivers. In the sun-scorched valleys of the south, small villages clung to the Nile's lifeblood. From these separate worlds rose an idea so powerful that it would change history forever: the birth of a single civilization. This is the story of Egypt's first dynasty, the moment when scattered tribes became one nation, and the vision of kingship was born that would endure for 3,000 years. To understand the glory of Narmer, the first pharaoh, who, with unmatched vision, strategy, and authority, transformed fragmented villages along the Nile into a unified kingdom, we must journey back over 5,000 years to a time before unification, when Upper and Lower Egypt were still two worlds apart. So, sit back, because this is Africa Unveiled. Before we dive in, I know many of you are watching from around the world, united by a love for Africa. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'll be in the comments engaging with you. And if you're enjoying the content, a like and subscription would truly mean the world to me. All right, let's get back to the video. Long before the name Egypt was ever spoken, the Nile was already a river of destiny. Each year, its floodwaters rose and fell, carving out the rhythm of life. Along its banks, two distinct peoples blossomed, separated not by language, but by geography, environment, and culture. In the south, where cliffs of sandstone and limestone pressed tightly around the river, small farming communities flourished. These were the lands of Upper Egypt. Here, as early as 4000 BCE, the Tassian and Badarian cultures learned to coax crops from the fertile black soil. Their villages were small, but their graves tell a bigger story. The dead were buried with care, accompanied by pots of food, tools, and even ornaments. Proof that these early Egyptians already dreamed of life after death. Over centuries, the Badarians gave way to the Naqada culture, and with them came transformation. The Naqada people painted their pottery with swirling designs, boats, animals, and strange abstract symbols that whispered of a new order taking shape. Their chiefs began to grow in power, controlling farmland, herds, and trade along the Nile. At Abydos and Hierakonpolis, settlements swelled into bustling centers, and chiefs began to demand loyalty, not just from their own people, but from neighboring villages as well. Meanwhile, in the north, the world was very different. The delta of Lower Egypt was a vast wetland, where countless branches of the Nile fanned into lagoons, marshes, and fertile plains. Here, the Ma'adi and Bhutto cultures thrived. They were traders, middlemen between Egypt and the wider world. Copper tools from the Levant, cedar wood from Lebanon, and exotic resins passed through their hands. The north was a land of open horizons, shaped by contact with foreign merchants who brought new ideas and technologies. At first, these two worlds, the southern valleys and the northern marshes, were distinct. The south prized its stone mesas and decorated ceramics. The north, its trade goods and connections abroad. But as centuries passed, their differences began to fade. By the time of the Naqada, period, circa 3200 to 3000 BCE, the artifacts tell a new story. The same kinds of pottery appear from north to south, the same symbols etched into ivory and bone. A cultural unity was spreading up and down the river, carried by boats and caravans. binding Upper and Lower Egypt more closely together. And yet, unity was not peace. Power was concentrating into the hands of a few great chiefs, and their ambitions collided like storms over the Nile. Archaeology shows us that one center in particular, Abydos, deep in Upper Egypt, emerged as the seat of rising kings. Here, rulers began to style themselves with a new emblem, a falcon, the god Horus, perched above a rectangle that bore their name. This was the birth of the Sirak, the earliest royal insignia of kingship. These rulers were no longer just village chiefs. They were kings in everything but name, controlling river trade, building fortified enclosures, and spreading their authority across the valley. Their symbols appear far and wide, stamped onto jars and carved into bone, suggesting that a single line of rulers was extending its reach. By 3100 BCE, the stage was set. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, remained divided in name, but the truth was undeniable. A tide of unification was rising. The Nile's people were on the cusp of something the world had never seen before. The first great state, ruled by one king. In the shadows of the Nile's dawn, one name begins to rise above all others, Narmer. To the people of his time, he was not yet the legendary pharaoh we remember today. He was first a man, a leader of Hierakonpolis, a thriving city in Upper Egypt, where falcons soared over temple roofs, and craftsmen carved ivory and stone into symbols of power. Narmer's story begins in the south, but his ambition reached far beyond. He was heir to generations of chieftains who had already begun stretching their influence northward. By the time he came of age, the rulers of Abydos and Hierakonpolis were no longer simple chiefs. They were kings in all but title, wielding authority over vast stretches of the Nile. Narmer inherited not just land, but a vision, a single Egypt united under one crown. Yet his rise was not won by strength alone. Narmer was a strategist who understood the delicate dance of politics. To rule both Upper and Lower Egypt, he needed more than soldiers. He needed alliances, and so he turned to marriage. By wedding, Queen Neithhotep, a noblewoman from the Delta, Narmer tied his bloodline to the powerful families of Lower Egypt. It was a union, not just of man and woman, but of two lands, sealed in the language of love and dynastic destiny. But alliances could not erase centuries of rivalry. Lower Egypt's great centers, places like Buto and Maadi, had their own rulers, their own pride, and their own armies. For decades, Narmer fought to bring them under his sway. His campaigns were relentless, absorbing smaller chiefdoms one by one. Each victory expanded his authority. Each conquest etched his name deeper into the annals of history. The evidence of his power is scattered across the land. His name, written within a sarek, topped with the falcon of Horus, appears on stone jars, ivory tags, and pottery shards from Abydos to Canaan. Even in southern Palestine, far beyond the Nile's fertile banks, fragments bearing Narmer's name have been discovered, proof that Egypt's reach was already stretching into foreign lands. By the time Narmer emerged as Egypt's supreme ruler, he had forged a new identity for himself, Pharaoh. He donned the Shent crown, a fusion of the tall white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. It was more than an ornament. It was a declaration. Two lands, once divided, were now bound together under a single king. Narmer's power was not just military. He laid the foundations of Egypt's first true state. From Abydos, his spiritual capital, to Memphis, the new political center near the Delta, Narmer oversaw an emerging administration. Scribes carved his name into ivory tablets to record shipments of grain and goods. Workshops turned out ceremonial palettes and finely carved vessels that bore his mark. Priests invoked the blessings of Horus and the two ladies, Nekhbet the vulture and Wadjet the cobra, goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt, who now stood together as protectors of his throne. The Narmer palette, one of the most iconic relics of ancient Egypt, immortalizes this triumph. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, raising his mace to strike a defeated foe. On the other, he dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, surveying bound captives and parading his victory. It is not merely a record of conquest, it is political theater carved in stone, announcing to all who saw it, Egypt is one, and Narmer is its king. Through force, diplomacy, and vision, Narmer transformed himself from a regional chieftain into the first pharaoh of a united Egypt. And with his reign began a story unlike any the world had ever seen, a story of divine kingship, monumental architecture, and a civilization that would endure for thousands of years. But behind Narmer's meteoric rise stood a figure just as powerful, though often overlooked, a queen whose name carried the protection of the goddess Neith, and whose influence would shape Egypt's earliest dynasty. When we think of Egypt's first dynasty, our minds immediately turn to Narmer, the warrior king who united the two lands. But history is rarely the work of one person alone. Behind Narmer's throne stood a woman whose name carried divine resonance, whose tomb rivaled those of kings, and whose influence may have reached farther than any queen before her. Neithhotep, the first great royal woman of Egypt. Her name, Neithhotep, means Neith is satisfied. Neith was a powerful goddess of war and weaving, worshipped in Lower Egypt's delta marshes. For Neithhotep to bear her name was no accident. It symbolized unity, binding Narmer's Upper Egyptian dynasty to the sacred traditions of the north. This is why many scholars believe Neithhotep was a delta princess, perhaps from the city of Sais, offered in marriage to Narmer to seal his claim over Lower Egypt. In this way, their union was more than personal. It was political, the living embodiment of two lands becoming one. But Neithhotep was no passive bride. The archaeological record gives us tantalizing glimpses of her power. Her name has been found at Abydos, Nakada, Helwan, and even in the Sinai, written within a sirek, a royal enclosure normally reserved for kings. This was unprecedented. For a queen to have her name written in such a way suggests that she carried authority nearly equal to Narmer himself. Even her titles reveal her unique status. One of them, consort of the two ladies, invoked Nekhbet, the vulture goddess of Upper Egypt, and Wadjet, the cobra goddess of Lower Egypt. Normally, this title belonged to the pharaoh, who ruled as the protector of both lands. For Neithhotep to share, it shows that she was more than a consort. She was a partner in kingship. Her tomb tells the same story. At Nakada, archaeologists uncovered a massive mud brick structure, one of the largest ever built at that time. Its chambers were lined with wood, and around it lay dozens of subsidiary burials, likely attendants sacrificed to serve her in the afterlife. This was a practice usually reserved for kings. For a woman to command such a burial was extraordinary. Her resting place, once decorated with wooden pillars and intricate roof beams, announced to the world that Neithhotep stood on equal footing with Egypt's earliest rulers. But perhaps Neithhotep's greatest role came after Narmer's death. Their son, Hor-Aha, was still young when he ascended to the throne. Evidence from seals found in later tombs, including those of King Den, identifies Neithhotep as mother of the king. This was more than a title. It was an office. In all likelihood, Neithhotep acted as regent, guiding Egypt's affairs until her son was old enough to rule in his own right. If this is true, then Neithhotep was not only the first queen of a united Egypt, she may also have been its first female ruler. Long before Hatshepsut wore the false beard of Pharaoh, Neithhotep may have governed the two lands, issuing commands, overseeing rituals, and maintaining the fragile unity that Narmer had fought so hard to achieve. Her influence endured for generations. Centuries later, her name appears in connection with King Den, one of the most celebrated rulers of the First Dynasty. Even then, scribes and priests remembered her as the woman who had shaped Egypt's earliest dynasty. Neithhotep's legacy is a reminder that Egypt's rise was not the work of kings alone. Queens, mothers, and regents played vital roles in sustaining the throne and guiding the state. Her serek, her titles, and her monumental tomb stand as silent witnesses to the power of royal women in Egypt's earliest days. And so, while Narmer is remembered as the warrior who united the two lands, Neithhotep must be remembered as the woman who ensured that unity endured. She was not simply a queen. She was a founder of Egypt's First Dynasty, a bridge between Upper and Lower Egypt, and perhaps the first woman in history to rule one of the world's great civilizations. Her story sets the stage for what comes next: the legendary Unification Wars and the iconic Narmer palette, a piece of art that has survived 5,000 years to tell the tale of Egypt's earliest triumphs. The unification of Egypt is often told as a single event, a mighty king marching north, crushing his enemies, and declaring himself ruler of the two lands. But history, as always, is far more complex. Egypt's unification was not the work of one battle or one year. It was the culmination of centuries of conflict, negotiation, and cultural blending. To understand Narmer's achievement, we must first picture Egypt around 3100 BCE. In the south, the people of Upper Egypt lived along a narrow ribbon of the Nile Valley, framed by cliffs and deserts. They wore the white crown, worshipped gods like Horus, and built their towns along the fertile floodplains. In the north, Lower Egypt stretched across the wide delta, a labyrinth of rivers, marshes, and islands. Its people wore the red crown, revered deities like Neith and Wadjet, and controlled access to the Mediterranean. For generations, these two regions coexisted, sometimes trading, sometimes fighting. Archaeological evidence shows that kings from Upper Egypt had long sought to push north. Scorpion II, Narmer's predecessor, left behind a ceremonial mace head, showing him wearing the white crown while overseeing irrigation works in the delta. This suggests that the kings of the south were already asserting authority over the north, perhaps through conquest or alliances. When Narmer came to power, he inherited this unfinished struggle. He was determined not only to dominate Lower Egypt, but to unify it permanently with the south. That meant more than victory on the battlefield. It meant a union of culture, religion, and identity. The symbol of this unification survives today in one of the most famous artifacts of ancient Egypt, the Narmer palette. Carved from green schist and discovered at Hierakonpolis, this palette was never meant for grinding cosmetics, as ordinary palettes were. Instead, it was a ceremonial monument, a piece of state propaganda in stone, designed to celebrate Narmer's triumphs and cement his legacy. Let us walk through its imagery carefully, for every detail speaks volumes. On one side, Narmer is shown wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. He towers above his enemies, grasping a kneeling captive by the hair, while raising a mace to strike the killing blow. This is no random scene of violence. It is the timeless Egyptian image of order triumphing over chaos. Behind Narmer stands his sandal bearer, reminding us that this act of war is also a sacred act, carried out under divine authority. Before him, the falcon god Horus perches on papyrus plants, symbolizing Lower Egypt. Horus is shown subduing the land, delivering it into Narmer's hand. On the reverse side, Narmer wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, the crown of his defeated enemies. He marches in procession, inspecting rows of decapitated foes, whose heads have been neatly arranged between their legs. This gruesome image was not mere brutality. It was a statement of power. Narmer was showing that he had ended the division of the two lands and brought both crowns under a single ruler. At the top of the palette, the heads of two bovine goddesses, often identified as Hathor, look down, representing divine blessing on his kingship. At the center, two serpopards, mythical beasts with long, intertwined necks, are held on leashes by attendants. Their twisting bodies form a circle, a symbol of unity. It is here that we see the heart of Narmer's message. Upper and Lower Egypt, once separate and opposed, are now bound together, their energies fused into one kingdom. But make no mistake, this unification was not peaceful. Archaeological finds tell us of violent struggles during this period. Mass graves at Abydos and Hierakonpolis contain the remains of warriors slain in battle. Fortified towns in the Delta show signs of destruction. Even the neat rows of decapitated corpses on the palette suggest that Narmer's unification was achieved through ruthless conquest. Yet Narmer understood that conquest alone could not hold Egypt together. He needed symbols, rituals, and institutions to reinforce the new order. This is why the palette is so important. It was not just a record of victory, it was a political tool designed to show Egypt's people that the two lands had been joined under one divine king. The crowns themselves became symbols of this union. Narmer was the first to wear both, and later pharaohs would combine them into the double crown, the red and white together, representing eternal kingship over a unified Egypt. This was more than regalia. It was the visual language of power, a way of teaching Egyptians that their king was no longer a local ruler, but a universal sovereign. The unification also transformed Egypt's religion. In the south, Horus had long been worshipped as the falcon god of kingship. In the north, the cobra goddess Wadjet protected the land. After unification, both deities became part of the royal imagery. Horus was elevated as the pharaoh's protector, while Wadjet was placed on the king's brow as the Uraeus, the spitting cobra that struck fear into enemies. This blending of religion, symbols, and crowns was Narmer's true genius. He understood that kingship in Egypt could not be held by force alone. It had to be sacralized, woven into myth and ritual, so that generations to come would accept it as eternal and unchanging. The Narmer palette, then, is more than an artifact. It is the birth certificate of Egypt as a nation. It marks the moment when Egypt stopped being a patchwork of rival chiefdoms and became a single unified kingdom under a divine ruler. From this moment forward, the pharaoh would be seen not just as a man, but as the living Horus, the embodiment of the gods on earth. And so, through war, blood, and sacred symbolism, Narmer created the foundation for the world's first great dynasty. His legacy would live on, not only in stone, but in the very identity of Egypt itself. But with unification came new challenges. The two lands were now one kingdom. But how could they be governed? How could a single ruler maintain control over a land so vast with its villages, farmlands, and temples stretching hundreds of miles along the Nile. The answer lay in the creation of Egypt's first system of administration, a bureaucracy that would give order to the kingdom and sustain it for centuries. Unifying Egypt was only the beginning. Narmer had conquered the two lands, becoming the first ruler of a single kingdom, but ruling it required far more than military might. Egypt stretched for hundreds of miles along the Nile, a fertile ribbon flanked by desert, and keeping such a vast land stable demanded innovation, something that had never existed before: government itself. From this necessity arose Egypt's first administration, a network of officials, scribes, and institutions that transformed kingship from mere conquest into a civilization capable of enduring for millennia. At the heart of this system was writing. Hieroglyphs, once the domain of religious symbols and decoration, became tools of statecraft. They recorded harvests, tracked goods, and marked ownership. Clay seal impressions from Abydos reveal jars of oil, linen, and grain stamped with the names of kings and officials, proving that resources were collected, stored, and redistributed under royal oversight. Writing allowed the pharaoh to project his authority far beyond his presence. Even in villages he never visited, the king's symbols marked his rule. But writing alone could not hold a kingdom together. Officials, men drawn from noble families, served as the pharaoh's hands and eyes. Treasurers oversaw the kingdom's wealth. Overseers of fields managed agriculture. Artisans produced tools and luxury goods, and priests maintained the temples and rituals that bound religion to kingship. Through them, Narmer and his successors extended order across hundreds of miles of river and desert. Agriculture became the foundation of the state, and with it came the first organized system of taxation. Each year, as the Nile flooded and receded, scribes measured fields and calculated what farmers owed to the pharaoh. This grain-fed workers supported the army and sustained the population in lean years. Taxation was not seen as punishment, but as part of the divine order. The people gave a portion of their harvest, and in return, the king protected them, fed them, and upheld Ma'at, the cosmic balance of justice and harmony. To administer such a vast kingdom, Egypt's first kings established political centers. Abydos remained the spiritual heart, but Memphis rose as a strategic capital, where the pharaoh could oversee both Upper and Lower Egypt, control trade, and guard the delta. Law and order, though primitive by later standards, began to take shape. Disputes over land, water, or trade were settled by officials acting in the pharaoh's name, embedding the idea that his authority was divine, not arbitrary. Religion and administration were inseparable. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic centers, owning land, storing food, and employing laborers and craftsmen. By linking his kingship to the gods, Narmer made every temple part of his machinery of state. Horus, the falcon god, became inseparable from the office of kingship itself. The pharaoh was the living Horus, and his officials served not merely a man, but a god. Even with bureaucracy and religion binding Egypt together, the First Dynasty understood that power rested on force. Rebellions could flare in the delta, and nomads prowled the deserts. A standing military, supplied through taxation and organized by officials, enforced order and projected power. Campaigns into Nubia and the Sinai brought gold, copper, and turquoise, feeding the machinery of state through conquest, trade, and tribute. By the end of the First Dynasty, Egypt was more than a kingdom. It was a civilization. The administrative structures created under Narmer, Hor-Aha, and their successors scribes, officials, taxation, centralized capitals, and the fusion of religion with governance, would endure for 3,000 years, becoming the backbone of pharaonic Egypt. The genius of Egypt's first kings lay not only in unifying the two lands, but in building a system capable of sustaining that unity for millennia. Among them, one name stands out: Hor-Aha, son of Narmer and Neithhotep, who carried the dynasty forward and perhaps founded Egypt's first great city. The story of Egypt's first dynasty did not end with Narmer. His triumph in uniting the two lands laid the foundation, but it was his son and successor, Hor-Aha, who truly built upon it. If Narmer was the conqueror, Hor-Aha was the consolidator, the king who turned victory into permanence and may have founded one of the most important cities in world history, Memphis. His name, Hor-Aha, means Horus the fighter, or Horus the hawk who strikes. Like his father, he bore the title of Horus, presenting himself as the living embodiment of the falcon god. This was more than symbolism. It was politics. Hor-Aha's reign was about proving that Horus, the god of Upper Egypt, ruled the entire Nile Valley, including the Delta. His rise to power was not without challenges. Some scholars believe Narmer may have died in battle, leaving Egypt fragile and uncertain. Hor-Aha's first duty was to assert control, quelling resistance in the Delta and securing the throne. Inscriptions hint at campaigns in Lower Egypt and Nubia, a reminder that the unity Narmer forged could not be taken for granted. Hor-Aha's most enduring achievement was likely the founding of Memphis, later known as Eneb-Hej, or the White Walls. According to tradition, he built the city where Upper and Lower Egypt meet, on the border between the fertile Delta and the Southern Valley. From this vantage, the king could control trade, guard approaches from the Mediterranean, command rich farmland and waterways, and stand as a living symbol of Egypt's unity. Legends tell of him diverting the Nile to create dry land for the city, a tale, whether true or myth, that commemorates him as a builder and organizer. Memphis became Egypt's first true capital, a city of palaces, temples, and workshops, holding power for over 2 millennia. The city also carried profound religious significance. Memphis became the center of the cult of Ptah, the creator god and patron of craftsmen. By anchoring his capital to this divine patronage, Hor-Aha fused governance with spirituality, making temples both sacred and instrumental to administration. Priests of Ptah would rise to immense influence, their power beginning with Hor-Aha's vision of Memphis as the heart of Egypt. Beyond administration, Hor-Aha projected Egypt's power outward. Campaigns into Nubia brought gold and cattle, while expeditions into the Sinai secured copper and turquoise. These ventures enriched the treasury and demonstrated that Egypt was no longer a collection of villages. It was a state capable of projecting strength and controlling resources beyond its borders. Life within Egypt also transformed. Pottery stamped with Hor-Aha's name, found from the delta to the south, shows his authority was recognized across the land. Farmers, artisans, and traders became part of a larger system. Taxes, rituals, and festivals tied them to a kingdom greater than their village. For the first time, the people of the Nile Valley were citizens of a unified state, connected to the vision of their living god, the Pharaoh. Hor-Aha was buried at Abydos, in a tomb larger than Narmer's, surrounded by dozens of subsidiary graves. Attendants sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. His burial also contained inscribed labels, some of the earliest written records, cataloging officials and goods, early steps toward the vast written culture Egypt would later develop. Hor-Aha's reign proved that unification was no fleeting dream. By founding Memphis, strengthening administration, and expanding Egypt's reach, he transformed Narmer's conquest into a durable system of kingship. He embodied the pharaoh as both warrior and builder, ruling through creation as much as force, creating cities, laws, and rituals that bound the people together. His achievements ensured that the First Dynasty was not the story of a single man, but the beginning of a line, a dynasty that would shape the ancient world for centuries. Yet Egypt remained fragile. Unity had been won, but its endurance depended on the rulers who followed, kings who would test the strength of these new institutions and push the boundaries of Egypt's power. Among them, one in particular would stand out, King Djer, remembered as one of the mightiest rulers of the First Dynasty. With Egypt united under Narmer and Hor-Aha, the foundations of the pharaoh's authority were secure. But a kingdom is only as strong as its continuity. Into this world stepped King Djer, Hor-Aha's successor, a ruler whose reign further solidified the First Dynasty and extended Egypt's influence beyond its traditional boundaries. Little is known of Djer's early life, but inscriptions and tomb records portray a king determined to build upon his predecessor's achievements. Like all First Dynasty pharaohs, he bore the Horus name, presenting himself as the living embodiment of the falcon god. His reign, believed to have lasted over 40 years, is remembered for stability, military strength, and administrative sophistication. The Nile Valley, though unified, remained home to powerful local elites and rebellious nomes, provincial territories that had once been independent kingdoms. Maintaining control required diplomacy, religious authority, and, when necessary, force. Djer was a king of both order and ambition. Archaeological evidence suggests he led campaigns in the Delta to suppress uprisings and secure Egypt's northern borders. At the same time, expeditions to Nubia and the Sinai Peninsula brought gold, copper, and semi-precious stones into the royal treasury, enriching Egypt and demonstrating its growing power. These campaigns were not only about conquest, they were instruments of integration. Djer established Egyptian administration and temples in newly subjugated regions, ensuring the pharaoh's authority and the blessings of the gods extended across the kingdom. His reign also refined the administrative system his father had strengthened. Scribes and officials recorded his activities, supervised grain storage, and coordinated large-scale projects. Seals from Abydos and Saqqara show that record-keeping was now essential to governance, allowing the pharaoh to manage trade, tribute, and labor over vast distances. King Djer reinforced the link between religion and kingship. As the living Horus, he was the divine intermediary between the gods and his people, maintaining the cults of Horus, Nekhbet, and Wadjet, the protective goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt. Temples, rituals, and festivals celebrated him as the guardian of Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, binding obedience to the state with devotion to the divine. Djer's burial practices illustrate the evolving royal mortuary tradition. His tomb at Abydos, designated Tomb O, was monumental for its time. Over 300 subsidiary graves surrounded the king's chamber. Servants and officials interred to accompany him into the afterlife. Ivory combs, decorated pottery, and ceremonial palettes found inside reflect the wealth, artistry, and ritual sophistication of the First Dynasty. The tomb was more than a resting place. It was a statement of authority, culture, and divine order, a visible testament to the pharaoh's power. Economically, Djer maintained Egypt's prosperity. Trade networks reached the Levant and southern lands, bringing copper, wine, olive oil, and other commodities into the kingdom. Domestically, the Nile's irrigation systems, grain storage, and taxation ensured that the pharaoh could support monumental projects, armies, and temples. His power was visible in monuments and felt in the daily lives of his people, from the fields to the granaries. King Djer's reign reinforced a central lesson of the First Dynasty. Enduring power relied as much on administration, religion, and ritual as on military might. He expanded Egypt's territory, secured its borders, and strengthened the institutions that allowed the pharaoh to rule for millennia. By the time of his death, Egypt had evolved from a newly unified state into a functioning kingdom, where the pharaoh's authority, backed by the gods, was recognized from the Delta to the First Cataract. The groundwork laid by Djer would benefit his successors, including the powerful King Djet, and eventually Merneith, the woman who may have ruled Egypt in her own right. The First Dynasty was now fully established, a divine monarchy, a centralized bureaucracy, and a culture of monumental tombs and ritualized power. The pharaohs of this era had forged Egypt not merely as a nation, but as a civilization destined to endure for millennia.